The industry has created, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes with the encouragement of the states, programs to address addicted gambling. But it's usually extremely low considering what the problems are. And when you add up the benefits and you do a valid cost-benefit analysis, the costs simply overwhelm the benefits. And I put up 2 or 3 overheads in this hearing to demonstrate that. It's really a slam dunk when it comes. This is not a debatable issue. I mean, there's no debate on this. The costs are just really very large. It's like drug addiction. They call it the crack cocaine of creating addiction, is this gambling addiction. So that's not my terminology. That's the overwhelming terminology of the majority of sociologists and psychologists who deal with the area. So it's a very large social problem. I remember Jesse Jackson Jr. coming to Chicago on Martin Luther King Day and saying this is and this is a very contentious statement, but he said these are the new economic chains on our people.
Well, my time is going. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, if you just indulge me an additional minute. I ask unanimous consent. I cannot pose a question to Mr. Vallandam, but let me say this. Even without this legislation, I think what you are suggesting that this legislation would go to the expansion of what may be a vastly costly disease, which is gambling, period. My concern would be, are we finding a solution to the cancer? Are we narrowing it to one isolated form of gambling, or when we can bring the industry in and challenge it to do a better job, period? If we don't have internet gambling, or if we have these carve-outs, we have a fractured bill, then we're still not getting to the sickness of gambling for those who are sick in doing it. And so I make that point, and I make the point that the bill seems to, and as I said, the proponent is not in the room, and I'm sorry that he is not, but hopefully we'll have some further explanation. I think we went through this before, Mr. Carville, and to Mr. Scott. We went through this before. But I conclude by saying this, that the issue of this gambling issue, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, needs to be broader than the immediate hearing that we have. And I'm going to put 2 questions on the record, so I'm going to end, and they can give it to me in writing. And then I will pose the question because I was taken aback by a hearing by the Energy and Commerce Committee on criminal activity with children and internet sexual activities. Again, I'm just making a brief comment, and I would commend to the chairman and the ranking member, since they were talking about criminal penalties in the Energy and Commerce Committee, that we might have a subsequent hearing dealing with the utilization of the internet for abuse against children. Let me read these 2 questions. Does the administration support total ban, or does it wish to permit the interpretation of horse racing, looks like interpretation of horse racing to be a subject to controversy? If the exception were deleted from H.R. 777, would the domestic horse racing industry stop this practice? In any event, we'll have these in writings, and I thank the chairman and the ranking member for the indulgence.
I thank the gentlelady. Now, folks, we're on a stopwatch to try to beat that floor vote, so I think we're going to have a second round. Mr. Kindt, you indicated you might want to make a statement during Mr. Conyers' questioning. Did you get a chance to do that?
No, sir. I'm fine, and I know that I was perhaps going out of order, and I apologize to Mr. Scott as a fellow Virginian in my former life when I addressed one of my comments to Representative Lee.
Okay, I wanted to be sure that you were heard.
Let me just say that in response to Ms. Lee's question, that from my limited knowledge of reading through the bill, and my interpretation would be I do not believe that it either enables or overturns the horse racing. Now again, the bill changes rapidly, but that is my interpretation at this point. And the only other point I would make with regard to Mr. Kindt, and I hope I'm not speaking out of order again, is that I think this debate in the legislative hearing would be introduced into any court proceeding. So Mr. Goodlatz and the intent of Congress would, in fact, be determinative, I would hope, if the court was having trouble deciding how to interpret the particular statute.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kindt. Mr. Banker, I pronounce banker a whole lot more precise than I do Mr. Vallingham. Mr. Vallingham, you testified that as it pertains to banks, H.R. 4777 would create a quote, added burden of monitoring all payment transactions for the taint of internet gambling. What section of 4777 are you stating that would create that burden?
Well, as I understand it, Mr. Chairman, it would criminalize anybody who was involved in the process of transferring those payments, including the banks, knowingly or unknowingly. So ultimately, we would be responsible for the monitor of those payments and the prohibition of those payments.
Well, is it true, sir, that the banking industry is already taking steps to assist in the identification of money laundering, one of the serious concerns related to internet gambling?
Yes, sir. The Anti-Money Laundering Act is something that we are vigorously pursuing, and in doing so, we identify those customers which we deal with, and we also monitor transactions of a certain threshold and report those, but we're not responsible for making any decisions about whether they're legal or illegal. We're only responsible for the reporting of those transactions, in which another entity makes the determination of whether those are viable transactions or not.
Thank you, sir. And Professor Kindt, I apologize for having demoted you to the School of Law. I didn't realize that it was an innocent omission on my part. I have exhausted my time. I'll yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kindt, you mentioned the question of whether the taxes could offset the social costs. If you've got $24 billion a year gambling on the internet, a large portion of which is from the United States, from which you're getting no taxes, some taxes would be more than what you're getting now.
Well, Representative Scott, we hear this, or I've heard this argument in academic circles for years, and basically, I think you raised the issue that I tried to start out with, which is that this is an international issue. We need to get the State Department in on this and start talking about this in terms of international economics and our friendship, commerce, and navigation treaties. And that would alleviate this type of problem. I think we're saying the wrong thing.
Let me tell you, if you're going to have an international agreement and you're going to come to an agreement, I think we're going to be on the short end of that stick, because most of the other countries it's already legal. So if there's going to be a consensus, it's going to be to legalize and regulate.
Well, with respect to Representative Scott, I think that what we are really doing here, and I've provided several law review articles just as introductions with citations, I think we're destabilizing the world.
You would simplify the thing by making it illegal to gamble on the internet, would you not?
Well, it's been illegal to gamble on the internet for ages past.
Okay, but I mean that's how you would address it.
And we're saying yes, and I think that's how the National Commission said they would address it as well, as a complete prohibition.
Mr. Orr, of the people that you have prosecuted for gambling, have any of them been for involving horse racing?
I would have to get back to you on that, Congressman. I'm afraid I don't have the answer.
Okay, now you believe the present law, it's illegal to gamble on the internet on horse racing?
Yes, that's correct.
And one time, having read the bill, before you talked to anybody, you concluded that it would not be illegal if the bill passed.
We certainly have concerns that the bill's language could be construed to permit that.
Okay. Mr. Van Landingham, do you know what the average size of a transaction for gambling?
I'm told that it's about $110.
$110.
Which is,
when you do drug money, you look for $10,000 transactions.
5,000 generally.
5,000, so they kind of stick out.
Yes.
100, couple hundred.
$110.
Do you know what the credit card entry on PayPal would be if somebody paid for one of these bills through PayPal?
No, I'd have to get back to you as far as what I'm assuming you're requesting the merchant code through PayPal for the identification of the payee. Is that really what you're asking about?
Well, and that wouldn't help you because you wouldn't know what it was for. If it was for a casino, you wouldn't know whether that was legal, illegal, gambling on the internet, or whatever. You just know the payee.
which is one of the problems with this.
And if the payee were an attorney who's serving as an escrow agent in France,
Additionally, identification of the payee would not be sufficient enough to determine whether it was a valid or non-valid payment.
are you aware of procedures that can identify someone in terms of age and residence?
No, I'm not. Not based on the internet. Now, obviously, if you meet with them in person, you do have that information.
Mr. Goodlatte is not here. I had a question on how they can do an interstate legalize and regulate intrastate. Anybody want to make a comment on that? Okay, you're back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I will leave it up to Ms. Jackson Lee. You're next in line, or Mr. Cannon. Mr. Cannon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just state, as a matter of precatory comment, that I believe gambling is a pernicious advice, and that, Mr. Kindt, I agree with you entirely. From everything I've seen, that the costs of gambling far outweigh any kind of benefits that a state or other or society could ever gain from gambling. I just can't understand lotteries. I just think that the craziest things that we do, it's a tax on people who can't do math, and those people tend to be poor anyway. So it's a horrible thing from my point of view. But as I was speaking about Utah and the problem that we have with having Utah law diluted, you were nodding. I take it you would agree that you would not want to see any carve-outs. That would be horse racing, whether this is a carve-out or we characterize it some other way, or lotteries online. You would like to see that not happen, I would think.
You're addressing your question to me, sir?
Yes, to Mr. Kindt, yes.
Yeah. From my limited reading of the bill and the way I read it and I understand it, I don't believe that it enables or overturns. I don't think it changes the status quo with
regard to horse racing.
With regard to horse racing.
You know,
Yes,
and you pointed out that what we're doing here, we're writing a law review article or we're writing a brief for a court. And the problem is, and I think Mr. Goodlatte, at the end of my time, you may want to address this, but it seems to me that what we are doing with this bill is being absolutely unclear about what we're doing with horse racing. And that makes the argument for the horse racers when they go into court, and I believe that Mr. Orr has already said that's probably going to be the case. So this bill is going to affect the arguments in court at least, and I don't know how you can say that we intend that this represents a policy against gambling, against horse racing, when in fact what we're doing is not dealing with horse racing. And now that Mr. Goodlatte's back, I'd appreciate it if you'd address that, but not right now, because I have another couple of questions. But that seems to be the core issue, and I've always resisted this bill only because of the narrow interest of the states. Utah is one of only 2 shining stars in the country that don't have any gambling, and that's always been my concern about this particular bill. Let me ask Mr. Orr. Dog racing interests have stated that Section 1084F will give horse racing an unfair advantage over other forms of racing. Convenience stores have stated that Section 1084F or D will allow states to take their lotteries online. Do you agree with those 2 statements? That is, that it's unfair, not that whether or not it would make horse racing legal, but that it would be unfair to dog racing.
We continue to oppose all forms of internet gambling. So I think I've made a general statement.
What about lotteries and convenience stores and their concerns in particular?
I would make the same statement.
Mr. Vlaningham, if I understand your testimony correctly, your concern with this bill is that courts will issue injunctions that would burden you with trying to determine the purpose of electronic funds transfers, and that's a concern, right?
Yes, it is. I mean, our transactions, check and ACH transactions, are uncoded. We would not only have to determine whether it was illegal or illegal, but where it occurred, and several other facets in determining whether it should be paid or not.
Right, and you've talked a little bit about credit card transactions and the kind of coding they have, but ACH, clearinghouse transactions, those are much harder for you to track.
Yes, we don't collect that information on ACH transactions. ACH transactions generally contain the routing number, the account number, and the amount. Therefore, the payee is not known and it is not tracked. And as we identified earlier, identification of the payee is not enough to be able to determine if this is a valid transaction.
Do you see that there would be a tendency for people to move away from these relatively traceable transactions, even ACH transactions, are traceable to some degree. Do you see that there's a tendency to move away from those to less traceable transactions like e-commerce transactions or foreign banking transactions?
Yes, if it was a criminalized